Negro Americans What Now by James Weldon Johnson, first published October 1934. Starting with the foreword. It is not my intention that the title of this pamphlet should carry a prohibitive significance. Probably some white Americans would read what I have written. The significance of my title is that I am not particularly concerned with whether they do or do not. I am writing directly to my fellow Negro Americans on the American question which most deeply affects them, to you, my fellows. What I shall write will be put in the simplest, clearest, most economic English that I can use. If this little book should happen to fall into the hands of a Negro youth in the darkest center of the land, I should like to have him able not only to read it, but to understand it. There was a day when rhetoric and oratory constituted the generally most used solving for our problem. Indeed, for many years the problem was nightly solved by hundreds of orators on hundreds of platforms. That day is past. We know that the present time demands a plain and reasoned statement of facts and endeavor to devise ways and means to meet those facts. I do not offer this pamphlet as a program. I do not believe that any one man or set of men can formulate a complete and practicable program. The most that can be done is to lay down certain lines along which a program may be worked out. This is all that I have here undertaken, nor shall I devote any part of this booklet to cataloging the wrongs we suffer and the humiliations that are put upon us. I do not rehearse them for the simple reason that we all know them by heart. The thing we seek to know is what to do about them. In the following pages I have, with the least possible amount of historical preliminaries and references, and as fully as the brief compass of the pamphlet allows, aligned the racial situation as it exists today, and pointed to the ways which I believe led out. James Weldon, Fisk University, Nashville, Tennessee, June 1934. Choices. The world today is in a state of semi-chaos. We Negro Americans, as part of the world, are affected by that state. We are affected by it still more vitally as a special group. We are not so sanguine about our course and our goal as we were a decade ago. We are floundering. We are casting about for ways of meeting the situation both as Americans and as Negroes. In this casting about we have discovered and rediscovered a number of ways to which we have given more or less consideration. Let us see if we cannot by elimination reduce confusion and narrow down the limits of choice to what we might be shown to be the one sound and wise line to follow. Exodus. Exodus has for generations been recurrently suggested as a method of solving the race problem. At the present time, there is being fomented by some person or persons in Chicago a plan based on the ideal of colonization. The plan calls for setting aside of a state or territory of the United States exclusively for Negro Americans. The ideal of physical separation of the races as a solution antedates the Revolutionary War. Thomas Jefferson strongly expressed himself in favor of the colonization of Negroes in some area on the coast of Africa. The first attempt, however, to put colonization into effect was made by Paul Cuffe, a free Negro and a ship owner of New Bedford, Massachusetts, who in 1815 transported at his own expense 9 families to Africa. The first attempt on a grand scale was made in 1820 with the American Colonization Society and the United States government behind it, an attempt that culminated in the establishment of Liberia. At the outbreak of the Civil War, there was another effort fostered by a group within the race, and some 2,000 colonists sought refuge in Haiti. The latest of the attempts on a large scale was the Garvey movement. All of these efforts practically failed, that is, they had no effect on the problem and in no degree changed the condition of the race in the United States. A century and a quarter ago, deportation of the free Negroes might have been feasible. A half century later, that was not a practical undertaking. Today, the deportation or exodus of the Negro American population is an utter impossibility. Not within a bounded period could 12 million people be transported, and before that period was over, the total number would be well above 12 million. Nor is there any place to which to take them. There are no more vacant places on earth, and no government in the world, with the barest possibility of Brazil as the exception, would welcome even 1/12 the whole number. Liberia would no doubt be as reluctant as any. None of the tribes of colonial Africa would relish sharing their best lands with us merely because we and they are of somewhat the same complexion. The United States government might purchase territory somewhere and deport us, but that would involve a pretty stiff political job and a financial expenditure that would make the figures of the National Recovery Program look small. We may cross out Exodus as a possible solution. We and the white people may as well make up our minds definitely that we, the same as they, are in this country to stay. We may be causing white America some annoyance, but we ourselves are not passing the time in this undisturbed comfort. White America will simply have to sustain a situation that is of its own making, not ours. Physical force. Our history in the United States records a half dozen major and a score of minor efforts at insurrection during the period of slavery. This, if they heard it, would be news to that big majority of people who believe that we have gone through 3 centuries of oppression without once thinking in terms of rebellion or lifting a finger in revolt. Even now, there have come times when we think in terms of physical force. We must condemn physical force and banish it from our minds, but I do not condemn it on any moral or pacific grounds. The resort to force remains and will doubtless always remain the rightful recourse of oppressed peoples. Our own country was established upon that right. I condemn physical force because I know that in our case it would be futile. We would be justified in taking up arms and anything we could lay hands on and fighting for the common rights we are entitled to and denied if we had a chance to win. But I know, and we all know, there is not a chance. It is, I believe, among the certainties that some day, perhaps not very far off, native blacks of Africa will be physical force if necessary, compel the whites to yield their extra privileges and amenities. The increasing inability of great powers to spare the strength resources necessary for maintaining imperialism will hasten this certainty. The situation of the African natives is, however, on one point at least, the reverse of our own, on the point of comparative numerical strength. Yet there is a phase of physical force that we are in the United States should consider. When we are confronted by the lawless, pitiless, brutish mob, and we know that life is for feet, we should not give it up. We should, if we can, sell it, and at the dearest price we are able to put on it. The revolution. Communism is coming to be regarded as an infallible solution by an increasing number of us. Those who look to coming revolution and why they should believe it is coming in the United States, I see no good reason. It is obvious that the United States is going through revolutionary economic and social changes, but the changes do not point to communism. Seem to think it will work some instantaneous and magical transformation of our condition. It appears to me that this infinite faith in communism indicates extreme naive. Those who hold this faith point to Soviet Russia as a land in which there is absolutely no prejudice against Negroes. This is an unquestioned fact, but I can see no grounds on which to attribute it to communism. There was no prejudice against Negroes in terrorist Russia. Terrorist Russia was the country that could honor a black Hannibal, the country that could make a mulatto Pushkin its national poet, the country in which university students in St. Petersburg could unhitch the horses from carriage of Ira Aldrich, the black American tragedian, after his performance of Othello, and themselves draw him back to his hotel. The simple truth is, the Russian people have no prejudice against Negroes. In considering communism with respect to the Negro, the question before us, of course, is not how it works in Russia, but how it would probably work in the United States. If the United States goes communistic, there will be the communists where would the communists come from? They certainly would not be imported from Russia. They would be made from Americans here on hand. We might we might well pause and consider what variations communism in the United States might undergo. I hold no brief against communism as a theory of government. I hope that the Soviet experiment will be completely successful. I know that it is having a strong influence on the principal nations of the world, including our own. I think it is a high sign of progress that Negro Americans have reached the point of holding independent opinions on political and social questions. What I am trying to do is to sound a warning against childlike trust in the miraculous efficiency on our racial situation of any economic or social theory of government. Communism or socialism or fascism or Nazism or New Deals, the solving of our situation depends on typically upon an evolutionary process along two parallel lines, our own development, and to bring it about of a change in the national attitude toward us. That outcome will require our persevering effort under whatever form the government might take on. It might be argued that although there is not and has not been any anti-Negro feeling in Russia, it is the country in which anti-Semitism was stronger than any other, and the oppression and repression of the Jews have been greatly abated or entirely wiped out by the communism. Such an argument goes to prove the possibility that communism in the United States will wipe out oppression and repression of Negro Americans and give them a status of equality. I grant the possibility, what though it may not be realized miraculously and suddenly, I grant that if America should turn truly communistic, by which I mean if it should adopt and practice communism without reservations and not adapt it as it has adapted democracy and Christianity, so as to allow every degree of inequality and cruelty to be practiced under them, that if the capitalistic system should be abolished and the dictatorship of the proletariat established with the Negro aligned, as he naturally ought to be, with the proletariat race, discrimination would be officially banned and the reasons and feelings back of them would finally disappear. But except to a visionary, there are no indications that the present or prospective strength of communism is able or will be able to work such a change, either by persuasion or by military coup. In the situation as it now exists, it would be positively foolhardy for us as a group to take up the cause of communistic revolution and thereby bring upon ourselves all the antagonisms that are directed against it in addition to those we already have to bear. It seems to me that the wholesale allegiance of the Negro to communistic revolution would be second in futility only to his individual resort to physical force. I have said that there is no apparent probability that the United States will go over to communism, but the same cannot be said about fascism. Most of us, it is true, have for a long years lived in the fascist South. So it is hardly possible that we could fare worse under a national fascist government. That may not be true as to our other minorities. We should oppose with our utmost strength any encroachment of fascism, for we have both a practical and a moral obligation to do all we can to defend the rights of our minorities as well as our own. Isolation or integration. By this process of elimination, we have reduced choices of ways out of two. We have reduced choice of a way out to two. There remain, on the one hand, the continuation of our efforts to achieve integration, and on the other hand, an acknowledgement of our isolation and the determination to accept and make the best of it. Throughout our entire intellectual history, there has been a division of opinion as to which of these two divergent courses the race should follow. From early times, there have been sincere thinkers among us who brought to the conclusion that our only salvation lies in the making of the race into a self-contained economic, social, cultural unit in a world, in the building of an imperium in imperio. All along, however, majority opinion has held that the only salvation worth achieving lies in the making of the race into a component part of the nation with all the common rights, privileges, as well as duties of citizenship. This attitude has been basic in the general policy of the race so far as it has had a general policy for generations. The policy of striving zealously to gain full admission to citizenship and regarding jealously each single advance made. But this question of direction of goal is not a settled one. There is in us all a stronger tendency toward isolation than we may be aware of. There come times when the most persistent integrationist becomes an isolationist, when he curses the white world and consigns it to hell. This tendency toward isolation is strong because it springs from a deep-seated natural desire, a desire for respite from the remitting, grueling struggle for a place in which refuge might be taken. We are again and again confronted by this question. It is ever present, though often dormant. Recently, it was emphatically brought forward by the utterance of an authoritative a voice as that of Dr. Du Bois. The question is not one to be lightly brushed aside. Those who stand for making the race into a self-sufficient unit point out that after years of effort, we are still Jim Crow, discriminated against, segregated, and lynched. That we are still shut out from industry, barred from the main avenues of businesses, and cut off from free participation in national life. They point out that in some sections of the country, we have not even secured equal protection of life and property under the laws. They declare that the entrance of the Negro into full citizenship is as distant as it was 70 years ago, and they ask, what is the Negro to do? Give himself over to wishful thinking? Stand shooting at stars with a gun? Is it not rather a duty and necessity for him to face the facts of his condition and environment, to acknowledge them as facts, and to make the best use of them that he can? These are questions which the thinkers of the race should strive to sift clearly. To this writer, it seems that one of the first results of clear thinking is a realization of the truth that the making of the race into a self-sustaining unit, the creating of an imperium imperio, does not offer an easier or feasible task than does the task of achieving full citizenship. Such an imperium would have to rest upon a basis of separate group economic independence, and the trend of all present-day forces is against the building of any foundation of that resort. After thoughtful consideration, I cannot see the slightest possibility of our being able to duplicate the economic and social machinery of the country. I do not believe that any other social special group could do it. The isolationists declare that because of imposed segregation, we have to a large degree already done it, but the situation they point to is more apparent than real. Our separate schools and some of our other race institutions, many of our race enterprises, the greater part of our employment, and most of our fundamental activities are contingent upon our interration, 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 I can't even say that word, with the country as a whole. Clear thinking reveals that the outcome of voluntary isolation would be a permanent secondary status to acknowledged by the race. Such a status would, it is true, solve some phases of the race question. It would smooth away a good part of the friction and bring about a certain protection and security. The status of slavery carries some advantages of that sort, but I do not believe we shall ever be willing to pay such a price for security and peace. If Negro Americans could do what reasonably appears to be impossible and as a separate unit achieve self-sufficiency built upon group economic independence, does anyone suppose that will abolish prejudice against them and allied opposition, or that the struggle to remain their self-sufficiency would be in any degree less bitter than the present struggle to become an integral part of the nation? Taking into account human nature as it is, would not the achievement be more likely to arouse envy and bring on even more violent hatreds and percussions? Certainly, the isolationists are stating a truth when they contend that we should not, ostrich-like, hide our heads in the sand, making believe that prejudice is non-existent. But in so doing, they are apostles of the obvious, calling upon the race to realize that prejudice is in actuality as a needless effort. It is placing emphasis on what has never been questioned. The danger for us does not lie in a possible failure to acknowledge prejudice as a reality, but acknowledging it too fully. We cannot ignore the fact that we are segregated, no matter how much we might wish to do so, and the smallest amount of common sense forces us to extract as much good from the situation as there is in it. Any degree of sagacity forces us at the same time to use all our powers to abolish imposed segregation, for it is an evil per se and the negation of equality either of opportunity or of awards. We should by all means make our schools and institutions as excellent as we can possibly make them, and by that very act we reduce to certainty that they will forever remain schools and institutions for Negroes only. We should make our business enterprises and other strictly group undertakings as successful as we can possibly make them. We should gather all the strength and experience we can from imposed segregation. But any good we are able to derive from the system we should consider as a means, not an end. The strength and experience we gain from it should be applied to the objective of entering into it, not staying out of the body politic. Clear thinking shows, too, that as bad as conditions are, they are not as bad as they are declared to be by the discouraged and pessimistic isolationists. To say that in the past 2 generations or more Negro Americans have not advanced a single step toward a fuller share in the Commonwealth becomes, in the light of easily ascertainable facts, an absurdity. Only the shortest view of the situation gives color of truth to such a statement. Any reasonable long view proves it to be utterly false. With our choice narrowed down to these two courses, wisdom and foresightedness, and possibility of achievement demand that we follow the line that leads to equal rights for us, based on the common terms and conditions under which they are recorded and guaranteed to the other groups that go into making up of our national family. It is not necessary for our advancement that such an outcome should suddenly eradicate all prejudices. It will not, of course, have the effect of suddenly doing away with the voluntary grouping in religious and secular organizations or abolishing group enterprises. For example, Negro newspapers. The accordance of full civil and political rights has not, in the case of the greater number of groups in the nation, had that effect. Nevertheless, it would be an immeasurable step forward and would place us where we had a fair start with the other American groups. More than that, we do not need to ask.